Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, part of Insight to and Sustainability Across Disciplines, which is a Faculty of Fine Arts and Faculty of Arts and Science collaboration. Today's event, Angles of Consequence, a site-specific solar performance for the climate with Meghan Moe Beitiks, Zoe Heffring, Alexia Maldonado Juarez, Milena Pereira, and Christine White. But there's more to that story. But we'll get to that. But first, let me help situate you. We are streaming to YouTube. We are live from Fourth Space. We are also located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge with daily activities, examining research questions and projects happening across the university. And we are running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting. So those of you joining us on Zoom, we love comments and questions in the chat. We can read them out during a Q&A period if we get there. And for those of you here in the space, same thing. If you have any questions later on, just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you. And it's now my pleasure to pass the microphone over to Assistant Professor in Theater and but Meghan Moe Beitiks, I would like to read a little bit of your bio.
Oh.
Just to give you some context before we pass it over to you. I know you're there. But I wanted to introduce Meghan Moe Beitiks, who also works with associations and disassociations of culture, nature, and structure. They analyze perceptions of ecology through the lenses of sight, history, emotions, and their own body in order to produce work that examines relationships with the non-human. This work often emerges as video, performance, installation, writing, or photography, depending on what arises from her process of research and improvisation. That's just to give us some context, but now I'm going to pass it over to Mo. Mo, it's great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much. What a lovely intro. Yay! I also want to say a big shout out and thank you to the Insight Symposium. This is like a really lovely opportunity for a bunch of sustainability nerds to kind of gather together through Fourth Space and just like see what everyone else is doing and like really embrace a lot of different approaches to thinking about sustainability, which to me is like a really core aspect of it, that there isn't one single way that we become a more sustainable society or culture. There's 1,000 different ways, and learning about how we do this is an important part. So you might notice I'm by myself at this table, and there are a number of names on this first slide. Very important names that have been crucial to the project. And that is because currently Concordia's Crew Union, which is the union that supports research assistants and teaching assistants, is on strike. So there's a number of folks who are out on the streets right now, and they are advocating for several very specific demands. So they want a pay raise, they want job security, they want a fair workload, and they want an end to academic retaliation and political oppression. And you can find more information on the Crew CSN website. I will say that, like, as an assistant professor who controls the amount of pay that my research assistants receive through the grants that I submit and my own budgeting process, that our team has always been paid above the minimum, especially for the graduate students. So this is also a note to colleagues that where you have capacity to make your lives easier and better for your research assistants, I encourage you to do so. And the rest of this presentation, I think, is a testimony to what that investment brings back. I am, as a faculty member at Concordia, I am part of the CUFA or CUFA union, the Concordia University Full-Time Faculty Association. And they have stated explicitly that they support our sister union's right to strike. And so I am here to continue the work, as I am personally not legally allowed to strike, but I'm allowed, but can name support for that union's right to. So though the research assistants are not here, we support them and are in solidarity with their efforts. Okay, so I'm going to continue. This is the basic overview. What I had hoped this presentation to be, what I invited the research assistants to do was to present a little bit about their own work and process within the project. And so what I'll be doing is reading slides that they created in response to prompts from me. So all of that being said, while I will read their notes and their words, it's going to be definitely coming from my voice and my perspective. If anyone is curious and wants to learn more about the project or the work of any of the research assistants, I really encourage you to reach out, and I'm happy to connect you, or if you want to email them directly, this is who they are. So for context, angles of consequence, when we talk about what that is, it's a research creation project. We're currently funded by a SSHRC Insight Development Grant, and it's composed of a series of site-specific performances that are going to be devised in response to the sun and human responses to global warming, created with custom laser cut and etched signal mirrors as scenographic elements. That was the original proposal, and it's constantly evolving. So the reality is that a failure to curb carbon emissions and to accelerate sustainable efforts eminently will result in drastic changes to our planet, including unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms. None of this is new to anybody. We all know that if we don't do things about global warming, that things will get worse. So the premise of the project is that the climate holdouts must be held accountable and effective climate actions held up as examples if we're to avoid climate disaster. And the reflection of sunlight is a creative approach to these efforts. It is also a distress signal. So part of the original work was based on signal mirrors that were assigned to World War II pilots. So the proposed project has two specific objectives, which is to hold climate holdouts accountable and to hold up climate advocates as examples. And that is in part by situating their work in real sites, real physical locations, and drawing attention to those sites and their connection to these communities and organizations through sunlight reflective performance. This approach is very much rooted in my own artistic practice. I joke sometimes very seriously that the project is essentially me making my artistic practice open access to a certain extent. So during the pandemic, I sort of became obsessed with reflected sunlight, in part because I spent a lot of time in my apartment watching sunlight travel over the floor. And that led me to be thinking about the very literal sun as a material. I think it's a little bit ostentatious to say a collaborator, but like material suggests that I have some sort of mastery or agency over it, which it's the sun. It's definitely the opposite, like power dynamic, right? If anything, the sun dictates the terms of the work. I cannot control it. I have no power over it. But I've made a series of art installations and device performances that either are shaped in response to the sun or work to reflect the sun. So the left is Shut Up, which is a work I created at the NARS Foundation in Brooklyn, which was an installation that was shaped around a single window in the gallery. And Untitled Desert Refractions was a devised piece and a sculptural work that I made with the Rogers Art Foundation in Las Vegas, and I worked with local performers to create a sunlight reflective piece that was also a meditation on power during Trump's first presidency. But obviously, I'm not the first person to work with sunlight as a meditation or a material. A lot of precedent exists, especially in the work of Olafur Eliasson, who's been working with a lot of celestial and geological entities for a very long time. This is one work that he's done with mirrors called Your Glacial Expectations. But in terms of working with mirrors, there's also a fair amount of precedent. Joan Jonas and her mirror piece, which dates back to 1969, is an iconic dance performance piece where the dancers hold mirrors that reflect the audience and the surroundings back to them. And more recently, Kanepa Hanska Luger and his standing rock shields, which were meant as kind of a defense mechanism for water protectors against enriching police forces. And I will say that when I'm thinking about engaging with mirrors, this aspect of reflecting reality back to itself is a core part of it. I will also say that Kenepa Hanska Luger's work is also poignantly relevant as directly related to climate, water, and land defense that is rooted in the indigenous communities, and I'll get more into that approach's relevance to the project in a bit. And there's also, yes, this precedent by Ukrainian activists way back in 2013, where again, protesters were holding up mirrors to the police to reflect them back to themselves. So in the first year of the research project last year, we created a series of test performances at different sites. And this is just a little glimpse into kind of what that process was like. But that's me as a test performer looking at what it means to reflect sunlight at these sites that are relevant to climate change. So there's a number of oil refineries in Montreal and Montreal Est, kind of like the northeast of the island. And so we chose a spot that was at a public park that was adjacent to a fair amount of fossil fuel infrastructure, including a docking station for several barges and ships and refinery tanks as well. And I have a glittery costume designed by Carolee Deli and makeup by Keith Fernandez. But I'll show more of that at a future event, which I'll plug in a bit. The future of one of the future events that I want to also plug is that what we're building to is essentially a season of site-specific performances created with reflected sunlight with these series of artists. So we have a solo artist, Sabina Gomez. We have a duo that is Isabella Leon and Lucy Fandel. And we have a trio that is Bastique Mila Figue and Oriana Confente. And these are artists that I selected from an open call last summer that received a really healthy response. It was really difficult choosing artists from like the really amazing pool of submissions that we received. And these are all artists who are really solid in their understanding of navigations of site, their research-based practices, their choreographic practices, and their considerations of both environmental and celestial processes. So these are some really lovely images that were created by our social media manager and graphic designer, Steffi Boucher. And if you want to check out more of like their process as we go, if you look at angles of consequence on Instagram, we're constantly updating it, and it's angles of consequence with the dots in between the words. So this is where Christine, who has been with the project kind of since the beginning, would have begun like reading her slides. So what I will be doing is from this point on for the rest of the presentation is I'll be reading the slides that the research assistants have created and their notes. So I asked the research assistants to create slides based on what's been useful for them in the research process and what has been their approach. Typically what we've done is we've met once a week and I've given them priorities or prompts for what to be working on in the following week. But how they approach that, I've left very much up to them with some space for check-in and questions. So in response to these questions of what's been useful to me and what's my approach, Christine responds, trust, autonomy, and flexibility, her approach in asking for help. And she has some notes here. And what she said is, what's been useful for me throughout the process of this research is the trust that Mo has had in my process, granting me the flexibility and autonomy to follow threads that excite me. I've been involved in this project since it began in the fall 2023 in an attempt to answer the overall research question and in the goal of identifying sites for the artists to perform at. I dove into which organizations had the largest impact on climate, both negative and positive, during the first year of the project. So a lot of Christine's training and context comes from looking at quantified evidence and identifying sites. So we set a very clear parameter when we were trying to essentially curate the sites that we wanted to invite performers to respond to. We wanted to look at what sites directly could we tie to an increase in global temperatures. That like we wanted to kind of reduce it as simple as possible because sustainability gets very complicated very quickly. So we focused very much on like who can we tie directly to the warming of the climate. Christine found a really great resource in the Corporate Mapping Project, which names different organizations as emitters, enablers, and legitimators. So if we continue this, Christine went down very deep rabbit holes in terms of getting into like interdependencies, political connections, financial connections, and found this kind of very interesting sort of mapping of the state of power in 2019 by Hudson and Friedson. But was consistently coming up with these really interesting sources where we really can't consider a lot of the worst actors that are warming the planet in isolation, that they are really connected to each other in terms of finances and power. And that's something that kind of kept coming up as a theme in the research. Oops, let's go back. So we do have this map currently embedded on our site, and I encourage folks to check out ofconsequence.org. If we could drop that in the chat, actually, in case people want to check it out. It's just ofconsequence.org. Then part of what Christine and Keith and Carolee last year were working on were essentially like looking at these organizations that were warming the planet and asking ourselves, where are they physically located? Where can we map them in reality? Where do they have offices? Where do they have holdings? Where do they have land? And entering that into this map as a resource to continually build. So I will say at this point that our immediate focus is the production of this site-specific season of performances. But our greater kind of meta focus is to create a series of open access tools that will allow artists to perform site-specifically with reflected sunlight anywhere around the world. So we're trying to provide resources to, when we get to the point of the conclusion of the project, that we can disperse our findings in a more general sense and allow anyone to kind of take up the model and reproduce it if they so desire. So one of the sites that we chose and landed on was, and Christine writes, zooming into Quebec, we chose Suncor Energy Inc.'s refinery in Montreal Est as a pertinent site to be explored by the artists Isabella and Lucy. This is, when we talk about organizations that are having a negative impact on the climate, it's the fossil fuel companies. It's very straightforward in terms of the data. It's very undeniably the fossil fuel companies. They have the most outsized impact. When we get to like, relative sort of negative impact, fossil fuel companies consistently are the worst actors. So recognizing, first of all, that despite the fact that Quebec has some of the cleanest energy in the world, asterisks, with all of the political context and problematic aspects of hydropower, we still do have refineries on site in Quebec and in Montreal. And so acknowledging those corporations' presence and existence. So Christine names asking for help as a prominent theme in the research. I think this might have been something that I said at a meeting, but she names that Lucy and Isabel encountered a phytoremediation project happening across the street from Suncor and asked to know the scope and current state of the project. Christine writes, I was limited in what I was able to find, and so I reached out to Michel Lebrec, professor at Université de Montréal and project lead. He agreed to meet the three of us to answer our questions, and we all enjoyed an informative relationship and a relationship-building exchange. Michel Lebrec sees the value behind the intersection of art and science. His project had successfully transformed what was a brownfield into a green public space. His vision for the site is to integrate public art and to consider the ways socially engaged art projects can help connect those to site. So this is one of the things that the artists kind of unlocked in terms of meaning about the site, was that they found out about this project, and then suddenly the site becomes this place of tension between the fossil fuel refinery of Suncor and this phytoremediation project that's happening right across the street. And so they're allowing that kind of dynamic of the site to inform the development of their work. So Christine names her approach as looking at quantified evidence and identifying sites. And then thinking about positive impacts like climate advocates in Quebec, then we look at the work of the Indigenous Environmental Network, Greenpeace, 350.org, and places, international organizations like the Rainforest Action Network or the David Suzuki Foundation. Christine writes, contrary to identifying sites like Suncor, it was less clear how to verify which organizations were concretely influencing the lowering of global temperature. Although a few organizations came up as key actors in countering the fossil fuel industry, to name a few seen here. She writes, I was stumped on how to measure the impact these organizations were having, so I reached out to a number of experts. Many confirmed that there's no real quantifiable way to measure this. It's much harder to prove the positive than it is to prove the negative. Christine writes, although they did confirm that the organizations I mentioned were having an impact through grassroots efforts toward influencing policy change through mobilization efforts, one example is the divestment movement that is said to have originated by student groups at McGill. So one of the prompts that we ended up using as a site in and of itself, which we took a slightly different approach when working with the group of Mila, Bastik, and Oriana, is that we prompted them to respond to 2022's Bill 21. So Christine writes, another example of policy change responding to grassroots initiatives is Bill 21 that passed in Quebec in 2022, which prevents any financing of new petroleum production or exploration products in Quebec. There are a number of organizations that contributed to the passing of Bill 21, many of which are based in Quebec. But rather than pinpointing a single headquarters, instead, Oriana, Confete, Bastik, and Mila Figuet were offered the creative freedom to interpret this bill and choose and celebrate and recognize the impact of grassroots initiatives at Montreal's Boise-Steinberg Park. And we'll talk more about that site in our season launch on May 1st, which I'll talk more about in the future. But when we talk about asking for help, Christine writes, asking for help has been a useful strategy for me. As mentioned previously, I had reached out to experts for advice on how to quantify the impact of climate advocates. Mark Hudson, the Department of Sociology in the University of Manitoba, is an author I came across in the book Regime of Obstruction, edited by William K. Carroll. Mark Hudson provided the resources Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon by the Indigenous Action Network. They provided concrete evidence into the efficacy of various tactics and campaigns led through the grassroots initiatives. Their victories against extractive industries are quantified by the amount of CO2 emissions prevented through having stopped or delayed fossil fuel projects. So I really recommend this report, Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon. It really provides the hard data of why and how Indigenous resistance has been effective in protecting the climate and preventing a number, like millions of gallons of fossil fuels from entering the market. And it has informed the development of the project in really crucial ways. I also want to give a shout out to Concordia's Indigenous Directions Office. Especially recently, they've been working with Indigenous climate action to produce a number of really informative workshops on Indigenous work in resistance to global warming. And I've been passing those workshops along to the artist team as a point of information on the development of their work. But this becomes especially relevant because we decided, based on that report, we chose the canceled East Energy Pipeline route as a site in and of itself. So this was a proposed pipeline that was meant to run through Quebec and through Montreal Est that would have been kind of a key vein of the delivery of fossil fuels into the city. And it was canceled explicitly because of local Indigenous resistance to the development of the project. So our artist Sabina Gamez will be responding to that site in her work. And that's part of how we're approaching the project, is that her performance will in and of itself be an acknowledgement of the impact of Indigenous resistance to global warming. So talking now of Zoe Heffring's research, in thinking of, in responding to the question, what has been your approach to this research? She responds, observation, curiosity, and thoughtfulness, which, if you know Zoe, is very Zoe. So she writes, I'm assisting Christine in the pursuit of publishing an article apropos of the project. The guiding thesis is what are some methodological approaches in making climate action visible through open access tools and performance. So she's done some mapping of the parameters of the project with Christine, and asked like is considering how student RAs have benefited or what they've learned, how to address barriers to access and knowledge and resources, and disperse them to a broader community. And she's also contributed to kind of a literature review that we've been developing and field work and selecting artists. So part of the project output is a fairly substantial Zotero that both Christine and Zoe have contributed to, as well as Carolee and Keith Fernandez, who were the research assistants last year and who graduated and moved on. That's also available on the website if folks want to kind of get an idea of our citation and depth. But yes, Christine and Zoe are working on articulating the project through their own lens in a paper. And part of that has been them kind of learning research parameters coming at them from different experiences. Both of them are very experienced academic researchers already, but have maybe not necessarily gone through the process of developing and submitting a paper. So they've been talking to librarians and going through the grad pro skills workshop to kind of beef up their approach. I will say a kind of unique dialogue that we've been having is that the process for peer review or submission for research creation is a very different beast than it is in the sciences or the humanities. And so we talk a lot in meetings about how we consider research differently when we're thinking about it in the arts and what it means to research when we're talking about creative processes. The parameters are different, the expectations are different. And what it means to be rigorous is like a little bit different as well. So I'm looking forward to Christine and Zoe hopefully coming back and being able to complete that thought process once everybody is resolved their differences through the strike, hopefully. If folks could play the videos, that would be great. So part of the process of this past year is we gathered all 6 of our artists together and brought them through a sunlight reflection workshop. You can play them both at the same time, it's okay. Yeah. And that sunlight reflection workshop included an ecosomatics workshop that was led by Gabriel Petrov. Ecosomatics is somatic movement exercised consciously and considering the ecological influence on movement. So Zoe found this inspiring as an emerging artist and liked the celebrating and supporting of the process of performance creation. Sunlight is a unique material to work with. It behaves really specifically. When we work with light as artists, we don't always necessarily work with light that behaves like sunlight, where the source is ubiquitous, it's coming from everywhere, but it's very contingent on the weather that day. How the light behaves is going to be very different on an overcast day or when clouds pass in front than on a bright sunny day, which thankfully we had for this workshop. So we invited the artists for basically a half day where we met each other, we talked, we played with mirrors in the sunlight, we learned how it behaved as a material, and we had this ecosomatics workshop. And there was also an opportunity for the artists to meet each other and kind of nerd out about each other's processes. Sorry, I messed up my mic. Little hand gesture there. Milena chose to talk a little bit about experiments and playtime. So we've had a few creative labs for ourselves as a research team. I talk about it as playtime all the time. I think I'm just almost trying to hype it up. Come on, guys, playtime. But what that means is that we're collecting and cataloging materials that reflect light. So we're very much constantly hunting for like used materials, like used mirrors or used acrylic, or like things that are shiny and could be used to reflect light. But we're keeping a catalog of them in case any of it is useful to the artists. We're also doing experiments with them, combining materials in different ways and seeing what patterns they produce when light shines on them. But we also have to think about these objects like aesthetically and in terms of concept and meaning. What kind of works, like visuality with movements, interacting with lights. And then we're also, one of the challenges that I have for the research assistants is like, could we develop a series of tools that are designed to reflect sunlight that could be used very flexibly in a number of different contexts. So one of my questions is, could we make a solar spotlight? Could we develop a toolkit that would be akin to something like a number of tools that you get if you're working in a theater or in a performance venue, where you have certain expectations in terms of infrastructure when you enter any number of performance spaces, maybe. Could we develop a number of tools that would have wide applicability regardless of performance context? So that ends up being some playtime in places like the Milieu Makerspace. So we recently just gathered a bunch of materials and we played with tubes and mirrors and different reflective materials and tried to see kind of what emerged from that process. So that's been part of our process as well. But all of this is centered around assisting the work of the artists. So we've been supporting the artists with data, research, and materials. We've been watching their process and seeing what works and moves for them. We're seeing what art can be and how we can assist them. And we're thinking about sustainability in both form and content, according to Milena. And this is some images of a site visit that we did with Sabina Gomez on like the part of the path of the canceled East Energy pipeline, and part of what she's interested in exploring in terms of contextualized with her work. So she's done multimedia projections with these kind of circular forms and shapes and multiple layers of light passing through and reflection, and is exploring that currently on the site. But I don't want to give too many spoilers in terms of what's developing. We'll get more into that on May 1st, which I will plug again at the end of this presentation. And then finally, Alexia, in response to the question of what's been useful for me and what's my approach, she writes, trusting our pace, space for trial and error, and brainstorming together. So she writes, my main tasks in this project have been to do research for one of the artists who posed the question of how we could burn fabric with the sun safely. Through it, I endeavored to further the research we already had and wanted to later offer artists around the world. I benefited greatly from Mo trusting our pace and our own ways of researching and asking questions about the research, as well as providing a space where we can bounce ideas and research with one another. I will say, I did not ask them to plug me or the process, whatever, so these are their words. I did not tell them to write these things. They're just being very nice. So, in terms of the needs for performance, this is Alexia's kind of stage manager brain coming through, which I really appreciate. And she articulates, we have to consider health, safety, legality, accessibility, and also staying true to the mission of the project, which is this like form of creative accountability, which I keep repeating to the artists and to the research team, that like ultimately that, and I've said this explicitly to the artists as well, that our goal in the process is to trust the artists and their process. Like having curated them into the project, I want them to feel free to build the project according to their own terms in a way that fits within their own process and portfolio. But I also have said explicitly to the artists, but our goal here is this creative form of accountability. So if I feel like we're going way off track, I will try to gently nudge us back onto it. So we do have these approaches of like trial and error, what works, looking for precedents and gathering information. And for Alexia, that involves setting boundaries, allowing us to explore more freely, and then like considering legal limitations. So she writes, in order to better understand what the options are that we can give artists, we first need to understand the risks associated and what the hard limits our bodies and society will give us. An example would be the risk of burns if direct contact with a high focal point of sunlight, or the risk of forest fires if sunlight is concentrated at high enough temperature, which would be a breach of Canadian law. So I will say I come from a performance art background where trust in the artist is centralized, where if an artist comes to you with an absolutely crazy sounding proposition, the immediate response is not, no, you can't do that, that sounds crazy. The immediate response is, tell me more. And so I'm really interested in having really difficult and challenging conversations that can maybe not necessarily be had in different contexts or forms without sacrificing sanity, safety, or a healthy process for everyone. And I'm really lucky that I think the artists that we brought on board are very much invested in that same question. So I talk a lot about trust, but to me there's a lot of different ways that we can embody that in how we're working with artists. And I'm gonna try and speed up because I think I only have 5 more minutes. So Alexia writes that when we're thinking about accessibility, we're thinking both of do-it-yourself materials and the open access tools, affordable tools and materials, and offer diverse options that give both similar and diverse results, such as sun dyeing and burning. So thinking when the artist wants to accomplish something, thinking about the multiple ways that we can help them do that without sacrificing anyone's creative vision or our sanity or safety. And then she writes, if our goal is to make working with sunlight as a performance tool available for artists around the world, we need to consider how accessible our research can be. We are a Canadian collective, and so most of our research will be within that context, but we can try as much as we can to make it sympathetic to affordability, different wants and needs, as well as skill level. She writes, I also wanted to put most of what we do in non-academic speech to try and reach as many people as possible. So we are creating currently a guide for performing with sunlight. And Alexia has done a lot of really heavy contributions to that guide, which we'll be launching in the future. But again, check out the website. We'll be updating it consistently as the project evolves. And so this is just a giant plug that we will be officially launching our season on May 1st at ForceSpace here. We will be having a group discussion with all of the artists who have been curated into the season, and hopefully the research assistants, assuming that folks get strike resolution by then. But I will say, we're launching in May. The performances are pretty much all taking place in June of this summer. So if you watch the Instagram and you watch the website, we'll have specifics in terms of times, locations. Because the sun is an important collaborator, we have for every performance a primary date that is our goal and 2 backup dates in case the sun decides differently. So there will be some kind of flexibility and rescheduling based on how the sun decides to show up for us. So that's the scope of Angles of Consequence. Thank you so much. We have a really extensive bibliography here. I'm just going to click through in case anybody wants to pause and screenshot and look at any of our references. But that is it. So if anybody, I think we have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any. But thank you for your attention. So.
Just to be, okay. If, questions, that would be good. I was just going to jump in to say, if there are questions on Zoom, just pop those into the chat and we can read them out. And anyone here in the space? Rebecca.
Hi, thank you so much. I am really interested in so much of this, and we'll talk after. But but part of the goal of this conference is to share across disciplines, right? The goal of most of my work at the college and the research center is to open up those discussions across disciplines. And I was once on the graduate committee, a master's committee of a student who was doing research creation. And I'm a trained biologist, PhD in biology. I know the scientific method of research, and the research creation to me is a black box. Right? right? I don't
Yeah.
understand it. It's a completely different thing, as you note.
Yeah.
So I guess I have a couple of questions around that. One is maybe just a query as to whether it would be useful in your opinion to kind of have workshops where we share methods of research, right? But then associated with that is a question of how prepared do you find students are when they begin to address research from a research creation method? Are we training students in elementary school and high school towards a scientific method of inquiry, or is it still an open mind? Do you find that teaching the research creation is more challenging from that kind of scientific background perspective?
Thank you so much. Those are great questions. So to the first point, absolutely. Yeah, I think like workshops across disciplines and sharing research methodologies are like super important. This is my third interdisciplinary position in academia that I've held. So pretty much every job that I've held, I've been hired in part because I have an interdisciplinary approach to my creative process. And what I find really consistently is that when I say interdisciplinarity, there's 1,500 different definitions that people have of what that means, and it's almost always couched relative to their own research field. And I really admire the work at Michigan State University Center for Interdisciplinarity. They have something called the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. And all they do is they gather researchers in a room and they share words where they're like, I use this word. And someone's like, interesting. In my field, that means this totally other thing. Or someone will be like, oh, interesting. We have that concept in my field, but we use this other word to describe it. I really strongly believe that miscommunication is the biggest barrier to effective collaboration in most contexts. And in academia especially, we are very conditioned to protect our own research and our own silos as a matter of our own value to the institution. We are very, very, very geared towards a defensive position that forces us to say, my method is the best, my method is important, my method is relevant. And I find that that defensiveness kills a lot of potential interdisciplinary collaboration because everyone needs to prove that they are relevant in order to get tenure or to get full professor or to feel like they have the respect of the field. And I'm interested in undermining that as much as possible in, like a healthy and, emotionally, cuddly way. So I think like workshops like that would be absolutely essential to kind of making that happen. Like, especially in moments of austerity now, everyone's instinct and response to austerity is going to be to withdraw to their silos, to be in a defensive position and be like, I'm going to protect my program and my body of work and my students, and that's going to be my priority. And so the more that we can build bridges across disciplines and recognize collective and shared needs and efforts, I think the stronger that we are as like fields of research and as institutions personally. So yes, absolutely to workshops. To the second question, so I have I want to say like I have a unique approach to research creation, but I also know in saying that I'm not the only one who has my approach. I think it's just harder to find specific communities. So my view on research creation and artistic research specifically is that right now the field is cacophonous, that there are a lot of different ways, there are a million and endless different ways to be an artist. Part of the institutional value of research creation is that it forces the arts to articulate its own value in terms that are historically set by the humanities and the sciences. It makes the work legible to these other fields in a way that previously maybe that was challenging or difficult, where artists would be like, I work ethereal, my work is not explainable, and that sort of thing. So it has value in that it makes the work legible to these institutional contexts. But to me, that is also its Achilles heel, in that art functions because we trust artists. Like, that is the value of art, is that we understand art to be an innately human process that is based on our human lived experience of the world. and our connection to, I would say, non-humans and the rhythms of the planet in general. So for me, it is crucial that if we're talking about research creation or artistic research, that we don't throw trust in the artist under the bus in service of institutional legibility. And I do see that happen in a lot of different research creation contexts where we continually put artists on the defensive in a way that is relevant to the sciences or the humanities, where we want skepticism in the sciences. We want people to like prove the validity of their research or the relevance of it, because we want to be sure about what that is. We don't want to perpetuate falsehoods. We want to be exact and truthful and factual, and we want to build on precedent. In the arts, building on precedent can be generative and innovative. It can also stifle innovation because we're contextualizing all of our work within the Western white men that have been canonized before. All of my research assistants come from different backgrounds. Some of them, like Christine, have a really deep knowledge of a kind of citational research practice that is more in line with the humanities. That has been extremely valuable and has contributed immensely to the work. Some of them come from more like, I build sets and I make props and I don't know that I understand this like citational context. And that has also been really extremely valuable contributed to the work because it centers the process of the artists. So what I find in terms of like preparation of the students, what I find really consistently pedagogically, both in my classroom and in this process, is that students come to the work really invested in how to do it correctly. They want to do it correctly so that they know that they are achieving a certain amount of professional validation so that they can, in theory, get jobs after university. And what I feel like is my kind of pedagogical impetus, both as a primary investigator and as a teacher in the classroom, is that I have to remind them what skills that they possess that are powerful and relevant and will contribute to the betterment of the work, that don't have to be erased in this context. That like them trusting their own process experiences knowledge is as important as them learning how to cite a paper properly. So that's kind of my approach in thinking about research creation, is that we really have to think about trust in our human experience and in the artists that we're working with and their process, which sometimes is quantifiable and sometimes is just absolutely not, and that's part of its value. And then we also have to be able to articulate what we're doing in these greater contexts so that the work is legible to these other communities. So that, like, so part of why I'm like out of my mind excited about the Indigenous Resistance to Carbon report is that it does exactly that, is that it says, because it's easy to say, oh, look at all this resistance and all these protesters again, and like, what does that do except to make people feel like their voice is being heard? No, we have data. We have data that like these efforts have actually actively like prevented millions of gallons of oil from entering the market. And for a lot of communities, that level of like requiring to prove themselves should not be necessary. But some communities desperately need that proof in order to build on that work, to invite that work in, to trust it. And so, so for me, it's like finding resources like that are a really important kind of bridge to the process. I think research creation is going to continue to be a kind of cat that is difficult to herd. And I think that honestly, that is a good thing, that there's an aspect of research creation that is an important monkey wrench into the function of an institution. And there's ways that we can do that really consciously in a way that expands the breadth of it and creates innovation, and that is also rigorous and even redefines what rigor is. So I am very much resistant to a singular norm around research creation, and to me, like part of the framing of research creation should be kind of a multiplicity and embracing of multiple approaches at its very core. So, yeah, no worries.
Well, we had a question also on Zoom.
Oh, okay.
And I think you might have touched on it when you showed your references, but you probably look at it differently. So I'm going to read it.
Okay.
Fatima asks, as an environmental engineering student who's interested in sustainability and climate change, how would they engage in discussions such as that you describe in the project, Angles of Consequence, and how could they find more materials in order to become more familiar with that type of work?
Amazing. So in terms of environmental, I'm super excited that an engineer is like excited about expanded practices. I definitely recommend looking at the website. We have a Zotero that is linked to the website that has kind of all of the relevant information. When we talk about engineering, the value of engineering is a lot of like what is known and what is stable, that you want to create something based on research that previously exists, so your bridge doesn't fall down or your building doesn't collapse, or that like if the solar panel works, that it provides regular power. And for me, I wonder about how can an engineer approach creative dialogues with a sense of curiosity, and use those kind of like very stable knowledge structures to support or frame a maybe more chaotic process. Like that would be a really interesting question to have, especially we're working with sites and thinking about architecture and thinking about position relative to the sun in a way that is not dissimilar to how architects kind of have to think about where is the sun relative to this building and how do I have to build it because of that. So I would say like approaching dialogues with a sense of honoring your own expertise, but having an openness to other processes that might not immediately make sense, and having a curiosity and a willingness to ask questions, and being supportive in that way, while also without like surrendering your own perspective or knowledge would be my kind of articulation of that. So, but yeah, super excited. Thanks for that question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Jim.
Thanks for that eloquent paragraphs on research creation. We'll just replay your recording for our classes. That's great.
Oh, please do.
Very simple question. How do the participants in your project, how do they feel about climate anxiety? Is it beneficial to them, the artists and the RAs? What's your thought about that? I mean, they're delving so deeply into it. Does it make them feel better in the end?
I think agency is an important response to climate anxiety. That like the feeling of doing something that is effective and having an impact is a great way to process. I will also say, if we're talking about like research and research creation, one of the empirical values that art has is a form of emotional processing. That we know factually that making art helps us digest things and helps us feel better. And so I see a lot of the artists, they might not necessarily be coming to meetings being like, oh my God, everything's terrible. They're actually coming kind of excited and being like, oh my God, we learned this and we kind of want to do that. And these are all very experienced artists who are curated into the project too. So they're very unfazed by certain challenges. But I will say that like, especially in the media age of like sound clips and kind of doom and gloom moments, like discovering something like the Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon report is, it's almost healing. Like, it's just like, oh my God, oh, we have numbers that prove that this is really effective. This is amazing. You know, like some of that is really restorative, like emotionally. For me personally, I can't speak to anxiety for the rest of the team concretely. I can only name what I witness. But I will say that like feeling like one has agency and information and capacity to respond does a lot to alleviate these feelings of doom and gloom and climate anxiety. And ultimately, I think the hope is to provide tools to I'll invite others to use to do the same thing to process that kind of darkness. So, yeah, thanks for that question. Any other? Yeah. Oh, one more.
PK.
Oh, several more.
Yeah, thanks, Mo. Really, really interesting.
Thanks, PK.
I have to dig it up for you, but there also have been studies of, I believe it's in Switzerland, in a community in a valley without any sunlight. And so
Oh, yeah.
they did the artifice of placing a reflective large mirror.
No, I'm familiar. Yeah.
Okay. But what happens is the people say, no, this is artifice. We are so habituated, and our community is one of darkness, let's say, from our perspective. So I actually think that the interesting thing about art and science is it's here. It's embedded in Concordia. I mean, with your program, I've heard how you're reaching out to and collaborating with scientists. Likewise, I know Kelly, our next speaker, will talk about her scientific collaborations with art. We have programs of neuroscience and artists working together
absolutely.
from McGill. So I guess my question to you is, how important is the collaboration, i.e., do we really need to understand the methodologies of science and art, or does it come through just learning for life and collaboration?
So one of the things that I feel like I have to articulate to the research assistants a lot is that once we start going down the rabbit hole of like different fields of research, it's tempting to take on an institutional level of pressure, which is like, my engagement with this field is not valid unless I have like a PhD level knowledge of like the biological context or energy consumption. And this is where I think the framing of research creation becomes really useful and important, is like our engagement with that field and that research is purposely for the context of this research creation process. So when I'm in dialogue with a biologist or a scientist or of a different flavor, my goal is not to come away with a level of knowledge that is equivalent to theirs. It's impossible, right? I haven't spent 20 years in, doing scientific research. But I often find that dialogues with scientists explicitly in person on the human level reveals insights and connections that you just don't get from a peer-reviewed paper. That like these humans have this accumulated wisdom and knowledge of working in their field for however long, and they'll come up with really simple observations that you're like, oh, that's how that works? I previously collaborated with physicists in a different work like 10 years ago, and I found that like I did not have to explain contemporary conceptual art to them like at all. Like physicists, especially theoretical ones, work really conceptually all the time. They're like, oh yeah, I get it, and they would just move on. Whereas like for a different field, that would be like a really long kind of explanatory process. But then they would also, because I was working in physics, they would also have these little insights of like, oh, like this is the way your neutrinos are functioning conceptually, and I would be like, all right, so it's just like, and like, it's those little revelations. Like I think Christine has been on the front lines of a lot of that. She's been in dialogue with a number of different professors and researchers in Montreal to kind of inform the project. And I feel like those conversations and insights have been really useful in informing the development of the project. So I hope that, I don't know, does that answer your question, I feel like? Or like, yeah, that basically, that it's not just about intellectually engaging with these other fields, that like, I find the person-to-person conversations are really crucial in how we're contextualizing our work. Yeah. And so that's another reason why this symposium is awesome, because it brings people into the room to talk about things together. Have we gone over my time limit, or are we okay with one more question?
We have, we could take one more question, the last question if there is one, or we could thank you. Well,
We're good, okay.
is there, no, I'll check on Zoom. No, we're good.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you guys, yeah. And thanks again to the research team, and I wish you a powerful and successful strike. So, oh.
Oh, there we go. Are we on? Hi. Sorry, I just wanted to thank you and to give a plug for the rest of the conference. Do stay in the space, come back, take a break. If you're on Zoom, come back. We have a fantastic lineup. We have the rest of today events all day, and then we have tomorrow in the Hall Building, 12th floor, and at Loyola on Friday. Throughout the rest of the conference, as the beginning of the conference, we do have some workshops on links between artistic practice and well-being and harnessing anxiety towards climate action, etc. We have some fantastic creative art therapists coming into the room today, tomorrow, and Friday. So just a plug for that. Do come back for that. For those of you on Zoom, you will have to come in person if you're going to come tomorrow or Friday. We would love to see you. For those of you in the space, please do take a look at the fantastic exhibits that we have from our student designers and artists. And if you're on Zoom, if you have a chance to come down to Force Space, they will be on exhibit for the rest of the day today. And then there is a recording already on the website of our student artists and designers talking about their work. So do check that out. We'll be back here at 11:45 fairly soon. So take a break and hope we'll see you back. Thanks so much.